The hospital room smelled faintly of disinfectant and cold metal, and Anna sat curled on the edge of the bed, her hands trembling as she clutched the thin blanket against her chest, her eyes fixed on the heart monitor beside her, its steady rhythm contradicting every symptom she claimed to feel, every weakness she insisted was real, every dramatic gasp she had practiced in the mirror for weeks, and yet no one in the room seemed to notice the subtle panic rising inside her, not even the nurse who entered quietly to check the chart clipped at the foot of the bed, flipping through the pages with a puzzled frown that deepened with each line she read, because nothing, absolutely nothing, supported the illness Anna swore was consuming her. Not the blood work, not the scans, not the observations recorded hour by hour. And when the nurse lifted her gaze with a softness that felt dangerously close to suspicion, Anna felt her stomach twist as if the truth lodged itself beneath her ribs, waiting to tear through the fragile story she had woven so carefully. Outside the room, the hallway buzzed faintly with distant footsteps, whispered conversations, and rolling carts. But inside, everything felt still, tense, suspended in the moment before collapse, and Anna knew, with an icy certainty creeping up her spine, that she was running out of time, running out of excuses, running out of ways to convince everyone that her pain was real, her suffering undeniable, her condition urgent, and as the nurse adjusted the foreline that carried nothing more than saline, the faintest shift occurred, a detail so small, yet so devastating, that Anna felt her breath falter when she noticed it. A detail that would unravel everything she had fought to maintain. And in that quiet, sterile room, she understood that the truth was already pressing against the thin walls of her lie, demanding to be seen. If you want to follow every twist in this story and uncover how one unexpected detail shattered the illusion Anna worked so hard to protect, consider subscribing so you never miss the unfolding of the next chapter, the next truth, the next breath she tries to control. Anna always woke before the alarm, long before the sun pushed its slow, pale light through the thin curtains of her small apartment, and she would lie there in the quiet, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchenette and the soft traffic murmuring from the street below, letting the silence settle against her chest like a familiar weight. She had grown used to that stillness, to the emptiness of the early hours when no one expected anything from her, and it was in those fragile moments that she felt closest to herself, or at least to the version she allowed herself to be, the version she could control. Her mornings always followed the same ritual, almost rehearsed, as if each action kept her grounded, kept her from slipping through the cracks of her own mind. She would sit at the edge of the bed, run her fingers slowly across her temples, inhale deeply, and then practice the shallow breaths she would later use when speaking to doctors. Breaths carefully crafted to sound weak, yet not exaggerated, breaths that made her lies feel real even to her. The apartment was small, barely enough space for a table, a narrow bed, and a shelf crowded with pill bottles that were mostly empty or filled with vitamins she pretended were prescriptions. She kept everything arranged in perfect order. Not because she liked organization, but because chaos frightened her. Chaos meant unpredictability, and unpredictability meant losing control of the narrative she had stitched around her life like a protective veil. She moved through the rooms with a quiet grace, turning on the kettle, wiping the counter, preparing a cup of tea she rarely drank. Each motion gave her something to cling to, a sense of normalcy she feared would disappear the moment anyone looked at her closely. Enough to see who she really was beneath the fragile exterior she worked tirelessly to maintain. Anna had not always been this way. There had been a time, not long ago, when she laughed easily, when she met friends for lunch, when she took long walks without rehearsing symptoms in her mind. But loneliness arrived slowly, creeping into her life through small fractures she ignored until they widened into gaps she could no longer cross. A breakup that left her hollow, a job she lost unexpectedly, family members who drifted away with the passing years, each departure pressing gently against her until the world felt too large, too heavy, too indifferent. And as her circle narrowed, as her isolation deepened, she discovered something subtle and intoxicating the first time someone showed concern for her well-being. It was a coworker who noticed she looked pale, who touched her arm softly and asked if she was all right. And the warmth that bloomed in Anna's chest in that moment felt like a lifeline. A reminder that she still mattered in a world that had grown frighteningly quiet. The attention was small at first, soft gestures that made her feel seen, and she clung to them with increasing desperation, allowing tiny exaggerations to become habits, allowing habits to become routine, and routine to dissolve into fully crafted stories she presented to others with downcast eyes and trembling sighs. It wasn't that she enjoyed deceiving people, it was that the sympathy she received filled a void inside her that nothing else seemed able to reach. Each moment of concern felt like a warm hand on her back, steadying her, reminding her she was not invisible. The lies became a bridge, not just to others, but to a version of herself she longed to be. A version who was cared for, protected, understood. And the more she leaned on that bridge, the more she feared it would crumble if she ever stopped pretending. Anna's co-workers grew accustomed to her stories, to her quiet apologies for missing shifts, to her soft explanations about migraines, faint spells, chest tightness. Some offered support, others suspicion, but all of them noticed her. And that attention wrapped itself around her like a thin blanket she refused to let go. Yet the small lies began to lose their effect, and she felt compelled to escalate them little by little, crafting symptoms with increasing precision, rehearsing details late into the night until she could recite them effortlessly. And each escalation brought a mixture of relief and a deeper unease, because part of her knew she was losing control, drifting into a version of herself she barely recognized. The hospital visits began gradually, each one a careful performance. She learned how to hold herself, how to speak in soft fragmented sentences, how to breathe as though each inhale cost her effort, and the doctors, overwhelmed and hurried, often accepted her accounts without digging too deeply. But as tests came back clear, as scans revealed nothing, as physical exams contradicted her claims, she sensed the subtle shift in their expressions, the narrowing of eyes, the almost imperceptible pauses that hinted at doubt. And Anna, terrified of losing the empathy she had come to depend on, pushed harder, creating symptoms more dramatic, more urgent, more difficult to ignore. Her life outside the hospital grew smaller, shrinking into long stretches of silence punctuated only by the sound of her own voice rehearsing the next ailment, the next reason to be cared for. She stopped answering calls from the few friends she had left, not because she did not want them in her life, but because she feared their questions, their expectations, their ability to see through the cracks she could no longer hide. She spent hours staring at her reflection, studying the way her shoulders drooped, the way her eyelids lowered, the faint tremor she could summon at will. It became a routine so ingrained that even she struggled to separate the truth from the performance. And beneath it all, beneath every carefully crafted weakness, lived a deeper fear. One she never spoke aloud, not even to herself. The fear of being ordinary, the fear of being unseen, the fear that without her symptoms, without her trembling voice and sorrowful gaze, she would disappear entirely, unnoticed in a world that moved faster than she could bear. It was this fear that guided her to the hospital once more, that anchored her to the bed where her story would finally begin to unravel. Because the one detail she failed to control, the smallest unexpected shift, was already working its way toward her, ready to expose everything she never meant to reveal. Anna first met Dr. Paulo on a gray Wednesday morning when the hospital hallways felt unusually subdued. The fluorescent lights humming faintly as if reluctant to wake fully. And she sat on a plastic chair outside the consultation room, rehearsing the shallow breaths and delicate winces she had perfected over months of practice. She kept her hands folded on her lap, fingers trembling just enough to look convincing. Her gaze fixed on the floor tiles, she silently counted to distract herself from the growing anxiety that prickled beneath her skin. She had faced dozens of doctors before, each one a brief chapter in the story she constructed around her life. But something about this appointment unsettled her, as if the air carried a quiet tension she could not decipher. When the door opened and a tall man with gentle eyes and a calm, measured posture called her name, she hesitated for the smallest fraction of a second, sensing a shift she could not yet name, and then rose slowly, pressing a hand to her temple in the practiced gesture of someone overwhelmed by invisible pain. Inside the consultation room, the light was softer, filtered through a half-drawn curtain that cast muted stripes across the desk where neatly arranged papers lay untouched. And Dr. Paulo motioned for her to sit with a warm yet observant expression. His presence felt different from the doctors she had encountered before. Not hurried, not distracted, but centered, as if he had learned to listen before speaking. And that quiet attentiveness made her uneasy. She began her usual explanation, describing her symptoms with the delicate cadence she had refined over countless visits, careful to leave spaces between sentences that implied fatigue. She spoke of dizzy spells, chest heaviness, weakness that came in waves, and each word carried the soft, trembling sincerity she relied on to make her story believable. But as she talked, she noticed that he did not simply nod or scribble notes as others had done. Instead, he watched her with an expression that was calm, thoughtful, almost too focused, and that subtle difference made her throat tighten with a confusion she struggled to conceal. He asked questions, not the typical ones she expected, but ones that veered into details she had never rehearsed. Questions about the timing of her symptoms, patterns of behavior, emotional triggers, daily routines. His voice remained steady and kind, yet his eyes held a depth of awareness that made her feel exposed, as if he could see the hesitation behind her carefully arranged words. His questions reached into corners she had not expected, corners where her story thinned and wavered. And she felt her pulse quicken under the weight of his attention. She tried to maintain control, adjusting her expressions, modulating her breath, weaving her answers into something that sounded coherent. But with every response, she sensed his quiet skepticism building not from doubt but from understanding, a kind of clinical intuition she had not encountered before. As he examined her, placing the stethoscope lightly against her chest, his movements were gentle, precise, lacking the hurried efficiency she had come to expect from overloaded doctors. He listened for a long moment, his brow softening in a thoughtful crease, and when he stepped back, she noticed the shift in his demeanor. Subtle but unmistakable, a small tightening around his eyes that suggested he had already begun to form conclusions she was not prepared for. He asked her to lie back so he could check her reflexes, and she complied with carefully measured slowness, letting her arm fall limply at her side as she gazed upward at the stark white ceiling. But when he tapped lightly at her knee, her leg twitched in perfect coordination, betraying none of the weakness she claimed. And the brief flicker of realization that crossed his face made her chest constrict with uneasy heat. Still, he said nothing incriminating, nothing accusatory. Instead, he offered her a small, reassuring smile, as if encouraging her to continue the performance she had spent months perfecting. But the more kind he appeared, the more frightened she became. Because kindness meant attention, and attention meant danger. She felt as though he were peeling away the layers she had wrapped around herself. Not through interrogation, but through compassion. And that frightened her more than doubt ever could. She had always relied on the distance between herself and the people who treated her, a distance that kept her safe from questions that ran too deep. But sitting across from Dr. Paulo, she sensed that distance collapsing slowly, inevitably, as if he understood something she had spent years trying to hide, even from herself. At the end of the appointment, he handed her a sheet of paper, a referral for additional tests she did not expect. Tests that would reveal nothing because there was nothing to reveal. And for the first time in many months, she felt the sharp sting of panic beneath the facade she had mastered. His voice remained gentle as he explained the procedures, but his eyes held a glimmer of something she could not interpret. Something that suggested he was already following a separate thread, a different story from the one she told. When she reached for the paper, their fingers brushed briefly, and she felt an uncomfortable rush of warmth. Not of attraction, but of exposure, as if he could sense the tremor she tried so hard to suppress. As Anna left the room, she felt the air in the hallway shift around her, heavy with a tension she could not escape. She clutched the referral tightly, her palms damp, her breath shallow. And every step she took echoed with the unsettling feeling that something in her routine had begun to unravel. She glanced back once and saw him standing near the door, watching her with a thoughtful expression, not suspicious, not judgmental, but deeply perceptive. And that look lingered in her mind long after she turned the corner. She felt something unfamiliar swelling inside her, a mixture of fear and curiosity. Because Dr. Paulo was the first person who seemed capable of seeing beyond her performance, beyond the fragile stories she told, and though she tried to steady herself, to cling to the familiar rhythm of her practiced symptoms, she sensed that this encounter would shift the path she walked, leading her toward revelations she was not prepared to confront. She stepped outside into the cool morning air, the city buzzing softly around her. And for a fleeting moment, she wondered what it would feel like to tell the truth. To let someone see her without the layers of sickness she had woven so carefully. But the thought vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by the growing fear that the smallest misstep could expose everything she had built. And yet, deep beneath the fear, something else stirred, something fragile and unsteady, because in the soft measured voice of Dr. Paulo, she had felt something she had not felt in a long time, a sense that someone cared enough to look past the surface, and that unexpected tenderness unsettled her more deeply than any suspicion ever could. Anna returned to the hospital 2 days later, with the same fragile shuffle in her steps, her fingers grazing the wall as if she needed support. Yet inside, she felt a tightness building, a simmering tension she could not fully control since meeting Dr. Paulo. She carried a folder tucked beneath her arm, filled with old medical papers she had gathered to make her story more convincing. Though most of them were duplicates, irrelevant forms, or printouts she barely understood. As she approached the reception, she noticed the way the nurse looked at her. Not unkindly, but with a curious tilt of the head, as if something about her did not quite fit the pattern. Anna offered a weak smile, her voice faint as she confirmed her name, but the nurse's hesitant pause made her stomach twist. It was small, subtle, something she might have ignored any other day. Yet now it felt like the first crack in the surface she worked so hard to maintain. Inside the examination room, the air felt warmer than usual, the faint hum of machinery and the soft rustle of disposable paper, beneath her creating an odd rhythm that matched the anxious pulse beating beneath her ribs. She perched on the edge of the examination table, adjusting her expression into one of subdued discomfort, ready to repeat her symptoms for whichever doctor happened to be assigned. But when she heard footsteps outside the door, steady and familiar, her breath caught. The door opened, and there stood Dr. Paulo, his presence, filling the doorway with that calm, unhurried energy that unsettled her more deeply than she wished to admit. He greeted her softly, his voice warm, his eyes tracing her posture with quiet attention. And she felt a tremor ripple through her chest as he stepped inside. He asked how she had been feeling, and she began her rehearsed explanation, weaving delicate descriptions of dizziness and chest heaviness, pauses that implied effort, sighs that hinted at ongoing struggle. But as she spoke, she caught a faint, almost imperceptible shift in his expression, not disbelief, not accusation, but something closer to recognition, as if he had begun to map the inconsistencies she tried desperately to conceal. His gaze lingered on her hands, resting too neatly on her lap. The way her breathing quickened only when she spoke. The way she pressed a hand to her temple with practiced precision. He made a note on the chart, his pen gliding slowly, thoughtfully, and Anna felt her throat tighten with unease. Then came the first strange detail, the moment that made her pulse stumble. He asked her to describe the dizziness she claimed to feel when standing, and she nodded dutifully, pushing herself upward with a shiver in her hands. But when she stood, her balance remained steady, her posture straight, her legs firm beneath her, and she realized too late that she had forgotten to exaggerate the movement. Dr. Paulo noticed. His eyes flicked briefly to the way she shifted her weight. Too natural, too unburdened by weakness, and though he said nothing, the silence that followed felt louder than any accusation could have been. Anna forced a stagger into her step, a delayed attempt to correct the mistake, but the damage was already done, resting between them like a shadow neither dared acknowledge. As he continued the examination, he asked her to describe her pain, on a scale of 1 to 10, a familiar question she had answered dozens of times. She responded with a soft, trembling 8, expecting the usual sympathetic nod. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and leaned closer, studying her expression with a gentleness that made her skin prickle. He asked whether the pain radiated or pulsed, whether it worsened with movement, whether it kept her awake at night. She provided answers she thought sounded plausible, but with each question she felt herself slipping, struggling to maintain coherence. At one point he asked her which side the pain favored, and she hesitated a second too long enough for his eyes to narrow just slightly, almost imperceptibly. That pause hung in the air like a suspended breath. Another sign emerged when he checked her pulse. She extended her wrist, her hand trembling with what she hoped looked like weakness. But his fingers rested lightly against her skin, and she felt his pause. A fleeting moment where he seemed to sense that the tension beneath her trembling did not match the calm steadiness of her pulse. She swallowed hard, avoiding his eyes as he released her wrist, his expression thoughtful, too thoughtful, as if he were piecing together something fragile, something hidden. He asked to review her folder of medical papers, and Anna felt a jolt of panic. She handed it to him with forced calm, hoping he would browse quickly, but instead he studied each page slowly, methodically, flipping back and forth between dates, checking signatures, scanning for patterns. Her throat tightened as she watched him notice the inconsistencies she had tried to bury, the mismatched dates, the identical test printouts labeled as separate visits, the irrelevant forms tucked between more official-looking documents. He made no accusation, asked no direct question, but his silence changed, deepened, sharpened into something that made her chest ache. Then came the moment that hollowed her from the inside. He gently asked her whether she had any recent symptoms that differed from the previous week, and she began to describe a new fainting spell she claimed had occurred 2 nights earlier. As she detailed the episode, she noticed him glance at her arms, at the unbruised skin she had forgotten to mark, skin that should have shown signs of falling if her story were true. It was a detail so small, yet so revealing. And she felt the blood drain from her face as his gaze lingered for a heartbeat too long. He didn't confront her. He didn't question her. He simply nodded, his voice soft as he suggested they schedule additional tests. Tests that would inevitably expose the truth she had been running from. But his tone held something unexpected, something unbearably gentle. As if he understood the weight she carried and the fear that had driven her to this fragile place. That tenderness, more than anything, made her want to flee the room. To disappear into the sterile hallways before he saw through every story she had woven. As she left the consultation, clutching the paper he had given her, she felt the strange signs swirling like quiet warnings around her. The mist stagger, the too steady pulse, the unmarked skin, the mismatched documents. Each one a thread unraveling the fabric of her carefully constructed reality. And deep within her, beneath the fear and the rising panic, lived a quiet truth she refused to face. A truth that whispered she could not maintain this story much longer. Not with a man like Dr. Paulo watching her with eyes that saw far more than she ever intended to reveal. Anna arrived early for her next appointment, far earlier than necessary, drawn by a mixture of fear and a desperate need to reclaim control. But the hospital's cold corridors only made her feel more exposed, more fragile, as if every step she took echoed the lies she fought so tirelessly to keep intact. She clutched her coat tighter around her, her fingers trembling in a way she could not fully disguise this time. Because, since her last visit with Dr. Paulo, something unsettled had taken root inside her, a growing certainty that he had begun to see through the cracks she tried to conceal. The thought haunted her, circling her mind with relentless persistence, and as she waited outside the consultation room, her breath came shallow, uneven, betraying the anxiety she could no longer hide. She shifted in her seat, glancing from one passing nurse to another, convinced each of them carried a silent question behind their eyes, a question she could not afford them to ask. When the door finally opened and Dr. Paulo called her name, his voice calm and steady, she felt a sharp jolt run through her body, a mix of dread and something she refused to name. She stepped inside slowly, rehearsing her fragility, letting her shoulders fall, her steps drag. But as soon as she sat down, she sensed the shift in the room's atmosphere. Papers were arranged neatly on his desk, test results she knew would show nothing, notes from previous visits, and a new file she did not recognize. He watched her with the same gentle attentiveness, yet something deeper lingered behind his gaze, something more resolute, as if he had crossed an invisible boundary and could no longer ignore what he saw. She tried to meet his eyes, but found herself looking away, afraid that one extended glance would shatter everything she had built. He began the appointment differently this time, asking fewer medical questions and more personal ones. Soft questions layered with careful intention, questions that reached into corners she usually kept sealed. He asked about her daily routines, her living situation, her support system. And each word he spoke felt like a hand brushing away the thin dust that hid the truth beneath her surface. She answered with practiced hesitation, the same frail tone she used to elicit concern, but the way he listened unnerved her. He absorbed her responses slowly, thoughtfully, leaving deliberate pauses that felt like invitations she did not know how to fill. His voice carried no accusation, yet with each question, she felt the walls around her begin to tremble, as if he were guiding her closer to something she was not prepared to face. Then he asked her to describe her symptoms again, not for documentation, but for comparison, and she faltered. She repeated the dizziness, the chest pressure, the trembling limbs, but the cadence of her lies wavered now, stumbling over details she once delivered with flawless precision. The hesitation did not escape him. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands, studying her with a stillness that felt overwhelming. She sensed the weight of his silence pressing against her, urging her to continue, yet she found herself lost in the very narrative she created. For the first time, she felt the edges of her story blur, slipping out of her grasp, and panic surged through her chest. He moved to examine her again, and the tension in the room thickened. When he asked her to lift her arm, she exaggerated the weakness. But he noticed the too controlled descent, the unnatural delay in her movements. When he checked her reflexes, she forced her leg to resist, yet the strain in her muscles betrayed her. When he studied her eyes with the small flashlight, she let her gaze drift, feigning disorientation. But his expression remained calm, almost compassionate, and that softness felt far more dangerous than suspicion. She realized he was no longer merely evaluating her physical state. He was observing her carefully, quietly, piecing together every inconsistency she hoped would fade unnoticed. The turning point came when he reached for the folder she did not recognize. With a steady breath, he explained that he had consulted with another physician about her previous visits, cross-referencing her symptoms with her test results. The words struck her like cold water. She felt her pulse quicken, her palms dampen, her breath catch in her throat. He spoke gently, yet each sentence carried a weight she could not bear. He mentioned patterns in her presentation, inconsistencies between reported pain and observed behavior, and his tone remained kind, unbearably kind. As he told her he wanted to understand her more fully, she realized then that kindness could be sharper than accusation because it left no room for defense. It touched directly the part of her she had buried deepest, the part that wanted to be seen yet feared visibility more than anything. Her throat tightened as she forced a trembling explanation, insisting the symptoms came and went unpredictably, insisting she had been struggling for months, insisting she would not lie about something so serious, but the words felt thin, brittle, dissolving even as they left her lips. He listened without interrupting, his eyes filled with a quiet empathy that made her chest ache. When she finished, he let the silence stretch, not to intimidate her but to give her space, and that space felt unbearable. She wanted to fill it with excuses, with half-truths, with the familiar performance she relied on, yet nothing came. All she could do was stare at her hands, her breathing shallow, her mind scrambling for a new thread to cling to. Then, he said something she did not expect. He told her he believed she was suffering, though not from the illness she described. The words hit her like a blow, not harsh, not cutting, but painfully accurate, and she felt her entire body tense. He spoke of stress, emotional strain, psychological pressures that could manifest physically, speaking carefully to prevent her from withdrawing, but she did withdraw. She felt herself shrinking, folding inward, terrified that he was approaching the truth she feared most. The truth she never allowed herself to consider. Her chest tightened as panic surged upward, her breath trembling as she searched for a way out of the conversation. Out of the room, out of the tightening circle of truth closing around her, she interrupted him with forced fragility, claiming she felt faint, hoping to redirect his attention. He rose immediately, concern flickering across his expression, and the sincerity of that concern made her stomach twist. She hated how deeply she needed it, how desperately she fed on it, how fearful she was now that even this could slip away. He helped her sit, offering a glass of water, and she felt the trembling in her hands intensify. He watched her silently, not with doubt, not with frustration, but with an understanding that felt unbearably intimate, as if he saw through the layers she thought were impenetrable. When the appointment ended, she could barely walk straight, not because of dizziness, but because of the storm raging inside her. She stepped into the hallway feeling raw, exposed, shaken by the growing certainty that he was uncovering her story piece by piece. The tension followed her all the way home, seeping into the walls of her apartment, making the silence feel sharp, almost punishing. She sat on the edge of her bed, clutching her coat, her breath unsteady, realizing she could not keep this up much longer. Yet, the fear of losing the only form of attention she had left consumed her, pressing against her ribs with unbearable force. For the first time, she sensed that the unraveling had begun, and no matter how carefully she tried to stitch her story back together, the truth was already pushing through the seams, threatening to expose everything she had fought so desperately to hide. Anna woke the next morning with the uneasy weight of yesterday's appointment still pressing against her chest, a heaviness that clung to her breathing and settled into the quiet corners of her apartment. She moved through her morning routine with trembling motions, brushing her hair slowly, adjusting the collar of her shirt, staring too long into the bathroom mirror as if searching for the version of herself she used to recognize, the one who could lie effortlessly without feeling the ground shift beneath her. But now even the reflection felt foreign. Her eyes seemed too alert, too aware of the danger that hovered just beyond her reach, and each small gesture she made felt layered with fear, a fear she could neither ignore nor soothe. She clutched her bag close to her chest before stepping out, rehearsing an answer for every question she imagined Dr. Paulo might ask, trying to regain the control that had slipped from her fingers. On the bus ride to the hospital, she noticed the first strange detail of the day, something small yet unsettling. A woman sitting across from her glanced repeatedly in her direction, her brows drawn together, her gaze lingering on Anna's posture, on the slight tremor in her hands. At first, Anna thought it was coincidence, but the frequency of the glances grew, and the woman's expression slowly shifted from curiosity to suspicion. Anna felt heat rise beneath her skin, her pulse quickening as she pressed her palms against her knees, forcing stillness into her fingers. It was irrational, she told herself. Just a stranger noticing her anxiety. Yet it echoed the sensation she felt in the hospital, the silent question in the eyes of those around her. Was she being seen more clearly than she intended? The bus rattled on, and she looked away, pretending to read a message on her phone, though her mind could not settle. When she reached the hospital reception, another unsettling moment occurred. As she approached the desk with her usual fragile demeanor, the nurse on duty glanced briefly at her chart before looking up with an expression Anna had never seen directed at her before. It was not the gentle sympathy she counted on, nor the soft concern she had learned to manipulate. It was a cautious, almost guarded look, one that made her throat tighten. The nurse hesitated for a second before handing her a small slip of paper with her appointment time, and the hesitation struck Anna like a warning. She stepped aside, holding the paper between her fingers, feeling its texture, its weight, as if it carried some hidden meaning she could not decipher. In that moment, she realized the atmosphere around her had changed. The shift was subtle, but undeniable. Something in the hospital's rhythm now pulsed with quiet suspicion. Inside the waiting room, she sat with her shoulders drawn inward, listening to the low murmur of conversations, the soft beeping of equipment, the footsteps shuffling past. Every sound felt amplified, every glance too sharp. She tried to focus on her breathing, crafting the shallow rhythm she used to convince others of her physical frailty, but the anxiety tightening her chest made it difficult to maintain the performance. She reached into her bag and pulled out one of the medical forms she kept folded neatly inside, smoothing the paper over her knee. It was one she had reused multiple times, altering the date on the top corner with careful strokes of a pen. But as she studied it now, she noticed a faint imprint beneath the ink, a remnant of a previous date she thought she had erased completely. Her stomach clenched. If someone looked closely enough, they would see the alteration. The realization sent a chill through her spine. Her name was called sooner than expected, and she stood with a slight stagger, reminding herself to let her body appear weaker than it felt. But the tremor that now shook her came not from performance, but from genuine fear. She followed the nurse down a narrow corridor toward the consultation room, her breath catching with each step. When she entered, she saw something she had not anticipated. A second folder lay open on the desk beside Dr. Paulo, one she did not recognize. It was larger, thicker, containing several printed pages, clipped together with a metal clasp. Immediately, her pulse surged. She sat down slowly, her fingers gripping the edges of the chair as she tried to steady herself. Dr. Paulo greeted her with the same calm tone as always, but his eyes held a depth she had not seen before. A depth that felt like someone piecing together a puzzle, someone standing on the threshold of realization. He asked how she was feeling, and she began her practiced explanation. But even as she spoke, she noticed his gaze drifting to her hands, then back to the folder, then to her posture. His attention felt sharper, more intentional. She shifted in her seat, her breath faltering as she tried to maintain control. That was when he gently slid one of the pages from the folder closer to himself, his fingers brushing the corner, his eyes scanning a detail she could not see from where she sat. He asked her about a fainting episode she claimed had happened last week, and she nodded with carefully timed weakness. But then he asked her to describe the bruise she had mentioned afterward, the one she never actually had, the one she forgot to fabricate. Her mind raced. She had spoken of it casually during their last conversation, believing it would strengthen the credibility of her story. But now, she realized she had forgotten to follow through. She stammered, describing its location, its size, its fading color, but the words felt clumsy, mismatched. He listened, his expression unreadable, and when she finished he simply nodded, making a small note in the margin of his paper. The pen scratches echoed loudly in her ears. Another revelation struck when he asked her permission to review her previous test results with her. She agreed reluctantly, and as he filtered through the pages, she saw something that made her chest tighten. Her name was spelled incorrectly on one of the reports, a mistake she had overlooked when printing the document from an online template. It was subtle but undeniable, a small discrepancy that could unravel the entire story. He paused for just a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as they moved over the misspelled name. When he looked up again, Anna felt the air drain from her lungs. She quickly adjusted her posture, feigning dizziness, hoping to distract him, and he leaned forward instinctively, concern softening his features once more, but the truth lingered in the space between them. The final, most devastating revelation came unexpectedly. As he prepared to schedule new tests, he reached for her bag, intending to retrieve the papers she had placed there earlier. She reacted too quickly, grabbing the bag tightly, pulling it closer to her chest. The movement was sharp, instinctive, almost panicked. Her breath hitched as she offered a weak explanation, claiming she feared dropping the contents. But the look in his eyes shifted. He had seen the fear, the reflexive protectiveness, and something in his expression told her he understood that her bag contained more than objects. It contained the fragile scaffolding of her story. She left the room feeling shaken, her body tense with the weight of each small revelation. None of them were accusations, none of them were confrontations, yet each one felt like a thread being tugged, loosening the fabric she fought desperately to hold together. And as she walked down the hall, she realized with growing terror that the truth was no longer something distant, something she could manage with careful rehearsals. It was approaching, steady and unstoppable, carried by the eyes of a man who saw more than she wanted anyone to see. Anna lay awake most of the night before her next appointment, staring at the ceiling as shadows shifted across the room with each passing car. Her thoughts tangling into knots she could no longer loosen, and when morning finally arrived, she felt hollow, as if something vital inside her had been scraped raw. She moved mechanically through her routine, barely tasting the tea she prepared, barely noticing the cold floor beneath her feet, because every part of her attention pulsed with the same unbearable fear. The fear that she was nearing the moment she would no longer be able to hold the threads of her story together. By the time she reached the hospital, her breath was unsteady, her hands icy, her mind bracing for whatever waited behind the consultation room door. The hallways felt narrower than usual, the lights brighter, the soft murmur of nurses somehow sharper, every detail amplifying the tension, tightening inside her. When she entered the room, she immediately sensed a shift, not just in atmosphere, but in Dr. Paulo himself. He stood beside the desk instead of sitting, his posture calm yet firm, and the folder she feared most lay open in front of him. Papers spread out with deliberate precision. He gestured gently for her to sit, and she lowered herself into the chair with a trembling exhale, clutching her bag against her lap as though protecting it from being pulled from her arms. For a moment, he said nothing, allowing the silence to settle between them, a silence that pressed against her chest with suffocating weight. She watched him with wide, uncertain eyes, waiting for the questions she feared, the accusations she dreaded, but instead, he began speaking with a gentleness that made her stomach twist. a gentleness that felt like the precursor to something devastating. He explained that he had reviewed her medical history more thoroughly, comparing her past visits with the recent tests. And he spoke of patterns that did not align, symptoms that contradicted her physical state, results that remained unchanged despite her reported decline. His tone remained soft, careful, but his words sliced through her like cold wind. She shifted in her chair, ready to protest, but he lifted a hand lightly, not to silence her, but to assure her he was not accusing her. He said he believed she was suffering, deeply suffering, but not in the way she had described. The phrasing struck her with violent clarity. She felt her pulse surge, her throat tightening as she grasped for air. Because it was the first time anyone had spoken so directly to the truth, she had spent months burying beneath layers of frailty. He opened the folder further and revealed something that made her heart stop. A printed timeline of her claimed symptoms laid alongside test results, notes from different doctors, and small annotations he had made, detailing moments where her behavior contradicted her complaints. And then, he slid a single sheet of paper forward, the one that shattered her carefully built defenses. It was a comparison of dated test forms she had provided with laboratory records the hospital kept on file. 2 of the forms she submitted had identical barcode numbers, something she had failed to notice when copying them. The discrepancy was undeniable. She felt her breath stutter, her body turning rigid with fear as her eyes scanned the page again and again, as if repetition might erase what she now saw. He spoke softly, telling her he understood how frightening it must be to feel unseen, unsupported, overwhelmed. He said that sometimes emotional pain takes forms we do not understand, forms that confuse even the person experiencing them, forms that shape themselves into stories meant to protect rather than deceive. But the words blurred around her, drowned by the pounding of her heartbeat as another sheet came into view. It was the form with her misspelled name, circled with a thin red pen mark. She felt heat rush through her face, her fingers gripping the arms of the chair until her knuckles whitened. Because the mistake was hers entirely, a careless oversight that now stood like a spotlight on the truth she feared most. And then he did something she did not expect. He reached gently for her bag, asking with quiet respect if he could look at the documents again. She froze, every muscle in her body tensed at once. She pulled the bag closer instinctively, holding it to her chest with a desperation that betrayed everything she attempted to hide. The reflex was so fast, so panicked, that even she felt startled by it. His expression softened even further, but his silence shifted into certainty. She understood in that moment that he knew. He knew the bag contained altered forms, printed templates, notes she had rehearsed. The fragile architecture of the illness she built to keep herself from sinking into invisibility. Her throat tightened painfully as she lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes, tears burning the edges of her vision. He said her name softly, asking her to look at him, and when she finally did, she felt the last barrier inside her weaken. His eyes held no judgment, only a painful kind of compassion, the kind that saw through her without tearing her apart, the kind she had longed for and feared deeply. He told her that she was not alone, that what she was doing was not uncommon, that people who feel unseen often find ways to make their suffering visible, even when the methods are misunderstood. He said he believed she needed help, real help. Not more tests, not more scans, not more rooms where she performed symptoms for people too busy to notice the fear beneath them. His voice remained steady, anchored by a calm sincerity that made her feel as though the floor beneath her was no longer solid. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked, splintering into silent fragments. She pressed a hand to her mouth, her breath trembling as she fought back tears. She whispered weak protests, insisting she had felt something. Insisting the symptoms were real in ways she could not explain. And, in a way, they were. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the aching hollowness that clung to her life like a shadow were real, unbearably real, even if the physical illness was not. But the words tangled in her throat, collapsing under the weight of her fear. Her shoulders shook, her breath stuttered, and for the first time she felt herself breaking in front of another person. No performance, no crafted fragility, just the raw helplessness she had carried alone for too long. He leaned forward, speaking with deliberate gentleness, explaining that her test results showed signs of anxiety, physical manifestations of emotional stress, symptoms that could mimic real illness. He described patterns common in psychosomatic conditions, and each word felt like a mirror lifting before her, reflecting a truth she did not want to see. She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks, clinging to the last threads of denial. But even as she denied it, she felt those threads unravel. She felt exposed, unbearably exposed, as though every layer she had used to shield herself had been peeled away. Yet there was something strangely relieving in hearing someone name what she had been too afraid to consider. The truth hurt, but it also felt like air after suffocating for months. Then came the final revelation, the one she had not anticipated. He told her he had spoken briefly with a psychologist who specialized in cases like hers, someone who could help her navigate the emotional pain driving her behavior. He said he wanted to refer her not to more medical tests, but to someone who could help her reclaim the parts of herself she had lost. Hearing this shattered her the recognition of her pain. The acknowledgement that it mattered, that she mattered, broke something open inside her. She felt her breath falter, her body trembling as the truth settled into her bones. This was the moment she had feared, and yet it was the moment she needed most. She left the room shaken, her mind spinning, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear, relief, and overwhelming vulnerability. The world around her felt blurred, distant, as if she walked through smoke. But one truth now echoed through her with undeniable clarity. The lie she built to survive had finally been seen fully and unmistakably, and the man who uncovered it did not condemn her. Instead, he offered her the first fragile glimpse of a way out, a way that required honesty she had never dared to give, a way that frightened her more than the collapse of her story, yet also pulled at her with unfamiliar hope. Anna sat alone in the small consultation room, her breath trembling as she listened to the muffled sounds of the hospital outside the door, each distant voice and rolling cart echoing against the walls like reminders of the world she no longer knew how to face. The truth she had fought so hard to avoid now hovered over her like a weight she could no longer lift. And the exhaustion from carrying her lies for so long seeped into every corner of her being. Her hands rested on her lap, fingers entwined so tightly they ached. And she stared at the floor as if the cold tiles could offer some path forward, some answer she had not yet considered. But there was none. Only the quiet hum of the fluorescent light above her and the slow thud of her own heartbeat, uneven with fear. When the door opened softly and Dr. Paulo stepped inside, closing it with deliberate care, she felt her entire body tense, her pulse quickening with the dread of what she knew was coming. He sat across from her, not behind the desk this time, but in the chair beside hers. Close enough for her to hear the steady rhythm of his breathing, close enough that she felt the gentleness in his presence rather than the authority of his position. He spoke her name softly, as if coaxing her out from behind the walls she had built, and she lifted her gaze with effort, her eyes already burning with unshed tears. He told her they needed to talk, not about her tests, not about new procedures, but about what had been happening beneath the surface of her symptoms. His voice held no accusation, no frustration, just a deep understanding that made her chest tighten painfully. She wished he would be harsher, wished he would let anger or disbelief shield her from the vulnerability she felt rising. But instead, he offered compassion, and compassion was the one thing she did not know how to protect herself against. He asked her gently what she thought was happening, what she believed she had been experiencing. The question pierced through her like a shard of glass, because she had no answer, not one she could say aloud. Her throat tightened, her lips trembling as she tried to form words that dissolved before they left her mouth. Her eyes fell to her hands again, and she whispered something barely audible, a fragment of denial, a plea for him to believe she felt real pain, real weakness. But even she heard the hollowness in her voice. He waited patiently, giving her space to breathe, space to unravel, and the silence stretched until she felt it crack open inside her. A sob escaped her without warning, small at first, then deeper, shaking her shoulders as she pressed her palms to her face. He moved a little closer, not touching her, but offering his presence like an anchor. And she felt something inside her begin to loosen, something she had held tightly for far too long. She pulled her hands away slowly, tears streaking her cheeks as she whispered that she never meant for things to go this far, that she never planned to deceive anyone. She spoke haltingly, each sentence trembling, as she described the loneliness that had crept into her life like a slow-spreading shadow. The sense of invisibility that had taken hold after losing her job, after losing people she once relied on. She spoke of nights spent lying awake in the cold quiet of her apartment, listening to the silence press against her until she felt she might disappear entirely. Her voice cracked as she admitted that the first time someone expressed concern for her well-being, she felt something warm and unfamiliar, something like being seen, and she clung to that feeling with a desperation she never understood until now. She told him how the small exaggerations began, how easy it was at first to mimic the symptoms she had observed in others, how natural it became to fold her sadness into the shape of illness because illness was visible, tangible, something people cared about. Her words tumbled into the air like fragile pieces of a confession she had kept buried beneath her ribs, and once she began, she could not stop. She spoke of the relief she felt each time a doctor frowned with concern, each time a nurse placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, each time someone acknowledged her presence. She admitted how shameful it felt to depend on something so artificial, yet how impossible it became to step away from it. She feared that without her symptoms, she would once again fade into the quiet corners of life, unseen, unmissed, unnoticed. As she spoke, she braced herself for his judgment, for the moment he would pull away, but instead, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes soft, his posture open, listening with a depth that made her tears fall harder. He told her that her feelings were valid, that emotional pain can carve itself into the body in ways people often misunderstand, that her suffering was real even if the illness she described was not. His voice held no condescension, only truth, and hearing it made her chest ache with both relief and heartbreak. She wiped at her cheeks with trembling fingers, trying to steady her breath as he explained that her symptoms resembled patterns seen in people facing deep psychological strain. People who felt overwhelmed by burdens they carried alone. He said she was not broken, not beyond help, not someone to be dismissed. He asked gently if she had ever spoken to anyone about her loneliness, her fears, the emptiness that had grown inside her. Her answer was a small shake of the head, barely more than a breath, and he nodded slowly, as if he had expected it. He spoke of the human need to feel seen, to feel understood, and he said that pretending to be sick might have been her way of reaching for connection, for care, for acknowledgement. The words hit her with quiet precision, cutting through her defenses in a way nothing else had. She pressed a hand to her mouth, overwhelmed by how accurately he described the pain she had never given shape to. It was the first time she heard someone articulate what she had buried so deeply within herself. Then he told her something she had not anticipated. He said he cared about her well-being, truly cared. Not as a doctor diagnosing a patient, but as a person witnessing another in distress. He wanted to help her, not punish her. He said there were professionals who could guide her through the emotional landscape she had been navigating alone. People who could teach her how to express her pain honestly, without needing to wrap it in illness. His sincerity pierced through her, leaving her defenseless. She felt herself trembling again as she whispered that she was afraid of letting go of the story she built, afraid of facing the emptiness beneath it, afraid of being seen without the shield of sickness. He reassured her softly that fear was natural, that healing required vulnerability, and that she did not need to face it alone. He offered her a referral to a psychologist, placing the paper between them like a bridge. And for a long moment she stared at it, unable to move. It felt heavier than any diagnosis, heavier than any test result, because it was the first step toward a truth she had avoided for months. She reached for it slowly, her fingers brushing the edge, her breath catching as she realized what the gesture meant. She was acknowledging her pain, acknowledging her fabrication, acknowledging the part of herself she had tried so desperately to hide. As she held the paper, her shoulders sagged. Not with defeat, but with the release of a weight she had carried far too long. Tears rolled silently down her face as she whispered an apology. Not for the lies themselves, but for the fear that created them. For the loneliness that consumed her, for the person she had become in the absence of connection. And in response, he shook his head gently, telling her she did not need to apologize for being human. His words settled into her like a soft, warm balm, soothing the edges of her trembling heart. By the time she left the room, her legs felt unsteady, her breaths deep and uneven, but something inside her had shifted. The truth was out in the open now, no longer hidden beneath carefully crafted symptoms. She felt fragile, exposed, but also strangely lighter, as though a door had opened quietly inside her, revealing a path she never believed she could take. A path built not on performance, not on deception, but on the possibility of being understood. And as she walked down the long corridor, she realized this confession, painful as it was, might be the first step toward becoming someone she could finally recognize. Anna walked out of the consultation room with the referral paper gripped tightly between her fingers, the thin sheet trembling as much as her hands, and the hallway before her seemed to stretch endlessly, each fluorescent light casting a cold glow that made the moment feel heavier, sharper, almost unreal. The truth she had finally spoken still echoed inside her, lingering like a distant tremor she could not silence, and every step she took sent a ripple of emotion through her chest. She moved slowly, as if afraid that any sudden motion might shatter the fragile sense of clarity she had begun to feel. The hospital sounds that once comforted her now pressed against her ears with overwhelming intensity. The beeping monitors, the rolling carts, the murmur of nurses, all reminding her that the world would continue moving forward, whether she was ready or not. Outside the hospital doors, the air felt cool and crisp, brushing gently against her tear-dried cheeks. And for the first time in months, she could breathe without forcing the rhythm of her breath to mimic weakness. She leaned against a low railing near the entrance, closing her eyes as the breeze lifted strands of her hair, and allowed the weight of everything to settle fully into her. She had confessed. She had allowed someone to see her beneath the layers of fabricated fragility. Beneath the illness she hid behind for so long, the relief was there, faint but undeniable. Yet it was followed by a deeper fear. The fear of what came next. Without the shield of sickness, she felt exposed, vulnerable, uncertain of who she was supposed to become. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she hesitated before taking it out, knowing the message would likely be from her supervisor. She had missed several shifts, offered countless explanations about her deteriorating health, woven lies she now regretted with a heavy heart. When she opened the message, her chest tightened. It was short, asking if she was okay and whether she could meet in the next few days to discuss her situation. The words were kind, far kinder than she deserved, and guilt washed over her in a wave so strong she had to grip the railing to steady herself. She realized then that her lies had reached farther than she intended, affecting people who had shown her genuine kindness, people she never meant to hurt. The consequences were no longer confined to the walls of the hospital. They were woven into the fabric of her everyday life. As she made her way home, she replayed the confession in her mind. The look in Dr. Paulo's eyes, the softness in his voice, the unwavering understanding he offered. She remembered how he sat beside her instead of across from her, how he spoke to her like a person rather than a patient, how he saw the loneliness she had carried silently for so long. The memory brought a subtle warmth to her chest, one tangled with sorrow and gratitude. She knew she needed to call the psychologist he recommended, yet the thought terrified her. Therapy meant facing emotions she spent years burying, unraveling memories she feared still held power over her, stepping into a space where vulnerability was not optional but necessary. She folded the paper carefully, placing it inside her bag as a promise she was still unsure she could keep. Back in her apartment, the silence felt different. No longer a refuge, but a reminder of the emptiness she once tried to fill with false symptoms. She sank onto the edge of her bed, her hands resting limply at her sides, and let her gaze wander across the small room. The pill bottles lined neatly on the shelf no longer held the meaning they once did. They were symbols of a life she had constructed out of fear, and now they seemed hollow, fragile, disconnected from the truth she had begun to uncover. She stood slowly, walking toward the shelf, and one by one she picked up each bottle, turning it in her hand before placing it back with quiet deliberation. She was not ready to throw them away, not yet, but she could no longer look at them through the same lens. They were remnants of a version of herself she was learning to let go of. Later that evening, as she sat by the window watching the city lights flicker to life, she felt a faint stirring of something unfamiliar, something that felt like possibility. She thought about calling the psychologist, her fingers hovering over the phone, her breath shallow with hesitation. She imagined what the first session might be like, what questions might be asked, what parts of herself she would need to reveal. The thought made her anxious, but beneath the anxiety lay a gentler whisper. A whisper that suggested healing was not an impossible concept. She placed the phone down without dialing, telling herself she would try tomorrow, and, for the first time that day, she did not feel crushed by the thought of trying again. In the days that followed, the consequences of her confession continued to ripple through her life. She returned to her workplace to speak with her supervisor, her heart pounding as she explained the truth, or at least the parts she could articulate without unraveling. She spoke of emotional struggles, of stress, of needing help. She apologized for her absences, for the stories she told, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. Her supervisor listened with a mixture of concern and understanding, offering resources and flexibility, reminding her she was not alone. The kindness overwhelmed her, leaving her both grateful and ashamed. She realized how deeply she had underestimated the support people were willing to offer if she allowed them to see her honestly. She also noticed how her interactions at the hospital shifted. Nurses greeted her with warmth rather than wariness, and when she passed by the reception desk, the same nurse who once looked at her with suspicion offered a small smile, a gesture that softened the edges of her lingering anxiety. And each time she stepped into the consultation room with Dr. Paulo, his presence carried the same steady reassurance. Though now the conversations centered on her emotional well-being rather than fabricated symptoms. He asked how she was coping, whether she had made the call, and even when she admitted she had not, he encouraged her gently, reminding her that change was a process, not a single decision. Eventually, on a quiet morning filled with soft sunlight, she found the courage to call the psychologist. Her voice shook as she scheduled the appointment, her hands trembling as she wrote down the date. But when she hung up, she felt something shift inside her, something small yet profound, like the first step onto solid ground after months of walking through fog. She sat in silence for a long moment, letting the reality of her choice settle in, feeling both terrified and liberated. The consequences of her lies had been painful, humbling, far-reaching, yet they had led her to this fragile beginning. A beginning shaped not by deception, but by the truth she had finally allowed herself to speak. And as the days moved forward, she understood that consequences were not always punishments. Sometimes they were pathways, difficult and uncertain, but necessary to lead her back to herself. Anna sat by the window of her apartment as the late afternoon light softened across the buildings, washing everything in a warm, quiet glow that seemed almost unfamiliar after the weeks she had spent navigating the storm of her own unraveling. And as she watched the city move gently below her, she realized how different the silence felt now. No longer heavy or suffocating, but open, spacious, like a new room she had never allowed herself to enter. The days since her confession had been filled with small steps, each one uncertain yet strangely grounding. And in those steps, she discovered a truth she had long avoided. A truth that did not condemn her, but instead offered her a softer way of understanding the person she had become. She felt the faint ache of vulnerability pressing against her ribs, yet it was no longer unbearable. No longer something she needed to bury beneath invented symptoms. Because for the first time, she was learning to let her pain exist without disguising it. Her first session with the psychologist had been quiet, careful, shaped by long pauses and gentle questions that encouraged her to speak at her own pace. And though she had struggled to articulate the depth of her loneliness, she left the room feeling something she had not felt in a long time, something like possibility. The process frightened her, but it also steadied her. And she began to sense that healing would not come in dramatic revelations, but in moments like these, small and patient moments where she allowed herself to be seen, without the layers of fragility she once believed were necessary. She learned to sit with discomfort, to breathe through the urges to fabricate, to recognize the fear beneath the impulse to be noticed, and each realization softened another corner of the tension she carried. She found herself reflecting often on the kindness she received after the truth surfaced. Kindness that did not disappear even when her lies did. Kindness that held her steady when she feared she would collapse under the guilt. Her supervisor continued to check in on her, offering a flexible schedule and small words of encouragement. And the nurses at the hospital greeted her with gentle smiles whenever she passed by. Even Dr. Paulo, whose compassion had been the catalyst for her unraveling, remained a quiet presence in her journey, reminding her in their brief conversations that progress was not linear and that she did not need to carry her burdens alone. These gestures, small and consistent, taught her something she had never truly believed. That genuine care did not require performance, that she could be valued without theatrics, without pretending to break in order to be held. As the days stretched into weeks, she noticed subtle changes within herself, changes that felt almost too delicate to name, yet were undeniable in their presence. She no longer rehearsed symptoms in the mirror, no longer clung to her bag with the anxious instinct of protecting her lies, no longer felt the same desperate pull toward illness as a means of belonging. Instead, she learned to sit with her emotions, to allow sadness and fear to surface without drowning in them. To recognize that weakness did not need to be manufactured in order to be worthy of compassion. The nights grew easier too, the silence no longer pressing against her like a threat, but resting gently. Around her like a blanket, she had finally learned not to fear. One evening, she gathered the collection of empty pill bottles from her shelf, holding each one in her hands before placing it carefully into a small box. She did not throw them away, not yet, but she removed them from the place of prominence they once held, acknowledging the symbolic weight they carried without letting them dictate the rhythm of her life. As she closed the box, she felt a quiet sense of closure settle over her. Not final, not absolute, but enough. She realized healing was not about erasing the past, but about understanding it. And in understanding it, learning to step forward without letting it define her. She returned to work gradually, feeling the steady rhythm of familiar tasks ground her in ways she had not anticipated. She no longer needed the faint tremor in her hands to draw attention, no longer crafted fragile tones to elicit concern. Instead, she greeted her coworkers with quiet sincerity, grateful for the chance to rebuild trust in small, steady increments. She learned to ask for help when she needed it, and each time she did, she felt the hollow spaces within her fill with something warm, something real, something she never found in the performance of illness. Months later, as she sat once again by her window, she felt a gentle shift inside her, a realization forming slowly, patiently, like a soft truth rising to the surface. She understood now that the fragility she once pretended to embody had always existed within her, not as weakness, but as humanity, and she no longer felt ashamed of it. She no longer believed that her pain needed to be dramatic to matter, no longer believed she had to suffer visibly to earn connection. She discovered the quiet strength of being honest, of allowing herself to be imperfect, of recognizing that healing was not a destination, but a continuous unfolding. As the sun dipped behind the buildings, casting long shadows across her living room, she whispered a small thought into the fading light, a thought that felt like the moral of everything she had lived through. Sometimes people pretend to break because they do not know how to say they are hurting. And sometimes the bravest thing they can do is allow someone to see the truth beneath the performance. She learned that being seen did not require lies, that being cared for did not require illness, and that her worth had never depended on the stories she crafted, but on the quiet resilience she carried all along. And with that realization, she felt something inside her ease, a gentle opening, as if the world had shifted just enough to let her step into it with a steadier heart.